I don't know what life was like for Bridget back then, but I can only imagine she had an awful lot to deal with and an awful lot to hold. And so she must have gone walking in that forest a lot and seeing the oak trees and remembering how old they were and how many storms they've weathered and how strong they were, but how supple they were too, and how they bent with the wind to allow even the harshest storms blow past. But they were rooted down into the ground so deep and so strong, there was nothing could knock the oak down, not even lightning. And so when a messenger came to her with a dark look and a frown furrowed, she knew there was bad news coming, and she sighed and she waited. There was news of a death or a problem or something she would have to do, but she would stay rooted, she would stay grounded, she would stay strong and flexible if need be. And she waited for the words to wash over her, but she didn't expect the torrent of emotion to be erupted inside of her when she heard that this messenger was asking her to come down to see her father because he was dying, and his last wish was to speak to Bridget one last time on his death's bed to make amends, or even just to see her one last time. Something might have risen up. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was shame, maybe it was guilt for all of the days of unspoken words since that horrible fight they'd had together. But she felt her feet in the ground rooting her down, and she felt her heartbeat in her chest leading her onwards and leading her out and away from Kildare and back to the small county beside the sea where her father was or would be.
Now the room was familiar that she walked into. Fresh rushes on the ground and a fire blazing in the hearth. It was a dark time of year. It was midwinter. And she remembered her father. And the last time she'd seen him, he was younger than she now was. And she was unprepared for the man she saw in the bed. There was an echo of her father in him, but the man she remembered was barely there. His skin was paper thin and his breath was rasping. And his hair was white and wispy, barely clinging to the top of his skull. But when he opened his eyes, they were bright and green still, and she didn't understand how this was the first time she'd ever noticed that he had the same eyes as her. She sat down beside him, carefully, unwilling to say the wrong thing to start the fight again, but not knowing how to approach him now after all this time. Until he smiled at her and said, "It's good to see you." And she sat with him then, and they talked. And they talked long. And for the first time, maybe the first time ever, he listened to her, and she listened to him. And she started weaving with the rushes on the floor. Something to do with her hands, really. But as she wove, she told him the story of Jesus and how he died on a cross to redeem everyone. And he smiled and he looked at that and he said, "That's a great story. And I know that a little different. I know that is the wheel of the year, and these the quarter days on them. Imbolg and Bealtaine, Lunasa and Samhain, showing us that the wheel ever turns, like the sun in the sky above us, day into night, life and death and rebirth, always around us, folding us into its cycle for all eternity. That's my notion of forever." And as they talked and as they listened, he told her the old stories of Brigid, the goddess, who'd built a sacred fire in an oak grove that only her priestesses were allowed to tend, that had a school there, where people would come for 10 years to learn, and they would study healing, and they would study smithcraft, and they would study brewing, and then they would spend 10 years out in the world learning all that they could, and then they would return for 10 years to teach the next generation. And how Brigid was born on Imbolg at dawn and rose up into the sky like a pillar of fire, and how where she walked, following her footsteps, following her feet, spring flowers blossomed in her footsteps as she left them behind. And for the first time, Bridget could hear him. And she could see now that strange, deep resonance she'd always felt. That woman whose cloak spread over Ireland, the way that she had lived her life, that felt like an echo, like a song, like a chorus repeated. She did not quite know what to make of this. Part of her shied away from this insight, wanted to reject it, wanted to be the woman of God, the saint. But she sat with her father, she listened to his stories, she told him hers, and they found more to agree on than to disagree on for the first time. And when he breathed his last, she was there to wash him, to lay him out. And when they put him in the ground, they raised a cross as his headstone. But Brigid made sure there was a circle around it too, for his son, for his wheel.
Now, it being the darkest time of year, Bridget didn't want to immediately go straight back home. She wanted to stare into that darkness, allow that grief take hold. Something in her needed to die, and she didn't know how to do it. She couldn't be around friends and colleagues and those who would pester her and ask her for guidance. She needed to find her own way to guide herself. And so she looked for the light. Still there, although it was very, very dark. It wasn't there for very long. Gradually, the sunlight lasted that bit longer. The nights weren't that long. She pulled her cloak around her as she walked north, the ragged landscape feeling as torn up and pulled apart as her heart did. And her feet were sore on the cold ground, but she kept on walking. It was the only way to move through the grief and the pain, the shame of not knowing that man she'd buried in the ground, a pain and a sadness that seemed to have taken over her that wasn't even hers. But she felt it from the ground. And on the wild west, with the wind buffeting and hitting and bashing her, she found shelter between rocks, under and beside hills. She lit small fires and warmed her hands. She continued to pray. One day, after not seeing anyone for so long in this barren landscape out in the Wild West, she saw a man while she was eating bland and plain porridge oats she had in her bag with her, sustaining herself through the dark days. She saw this man was carrying a sack of salt, and she remembered salt. The taste of salt be great. So she thought to ask the man for a simple pinch to flavour the salt, flavour the porridge with a bit of salt. She thought really nice. And she was always so easy with giving. She would accept the same in receiving. When the man looked her up and down and saw a woman that was dirty and ragged, disgraced and clearly an outcast, he looked at her and said, "No, These are not salt at all. No, this is they have rocks. You would on rocks in your porridge. That'd be shite, wouldn't it? I'm gonna go now. Well, with that bare-faced lies something broke inside of Bridget. And she got angry, more angry than she'd ever been, more angry than the woman with the apples, more angry than the leper. Now words came to her lips and a flame rose up inside her, and anger came from a long before, and she said, "Oh, is it rocks, is it? Well, rocks be they so!" And every grain of salt in that bag turned to a great heavy rock, and that man was crushed underneath the weight of his own lie. She realized what she had done, and she fell to her knees. She saw the pile of rocks that had killed this man from her words, her strength. She brought it about. It went against her religion. It went against the way of Jesus, but it didn't feel all that wrong. He fucking deserved it, though.
Felt good, man. Felt good.
She was so torn. It was so confusing.
So she stayed still. She was wise enough by now to know that when everything is pulling you in 10 different directions, the best thing you can do is root down and be still for a minute and let the sky wheel above you and let you root yourself down. And just let it all settle. Let it all rest. And she stayed there as the sky began to darken, as the sun began to set, as the wide open, dead eyes of that man stared up, and she saw the cold, frosty stars reflected in them. And it seemed that she dreamed without closing her eyes. She dreamed without sleeping. And in her dream, she was herself. She was younger again, stronger than she'd ever been. And she was carrying a sword in her hand, a sword that she knew somehow she'd forged herself. And she was leading a company of warriors. And she knew without knowing that these were her people, the Tuatha De Danann. And she was herself. She was Brigid, and she was fighting at the head of a company against the Fomorians at the Battle of Moitura. She was not concerned with the war. She was not concerned with the Fomorians. She was concerned with one person on that battlefield, and she was fighting her way to get to him. She was fighting to get to her son, Ruadán, his father, Fomorian, his mother, Brigid of the Tuatha De Danann. And she didn't know why Ruadán had decided to fight on the other side. She wanted to protect him still. Even against betrayal, she wanted to keep her son safe. And she saw him. Through the fighting, through the battle, she saw her brother and her son fighting a combat against each other. She tried to cry out, she tried to stop them, but her voice didn't carry, and she saw it. She watched as her brother struck down her only son. And there on that ancient battlefield, with the banners flying around her, with the sounds and the screams of the dying and the clash of weapons, she felt that grief sweep over her in a torrent. And she opened her mouth and she sang the keening, the first keening in Ireland, giving voice to all that grief and all that pain. And she did not know as she sang if she'd failed him by loving him too much or not enough. And she poured it all out like a fire in that song of grief and remorse and guilt and shame. And as she sang in that dream without sleeping, so she sang by the side of the road, keening the dead man, keening her father, keening everyone she hadn't been able to heal, keening every soul lost, keening for all that was dying in Ireland. She sang her grief into the night sky. And when she had emptied herself out, she sat and she waited. She waited, and when the sun rose and the first rays struck her face, she knew what day it was. She felt she understood now. The fire of grief was a cleansing, as winter is a cleansing. It makes way in its destruction for rebirth. And as Imbolg dawned, Brigid stood. And when she turned to follow her feet back home, spring flowers blossomed in her wake. And so she walks every year across the land, touching the cloaks left out, bringing the spring flowers to blossom. And everywhere she goes, there is music.